For my final presentation, I chose testing accommodations, more specifically, teachers' judgments and their knowledge on appropriate accommodations for students with disabilities. Differentiation between what constitutes an accommodation versus a modification can sometimes become confusing. So, a quick review of what an accommodation is. It's a change that removes any potential or current barrier to instruction and will provide an individual equal access to learning. It also does not change what the individual is learning, it changes how they learn. For example, a student who has difficulty reading may be given an audiobook. This removes the barrier of the reading difficulty and allows the student to still have equal access to learning. Accommodations do not lower expectations of what the student is required or expected to know. Before we get into the research, I wanted to give a quick overview on some background info on test accommodations for students with disabilities. So what exactly are test accommodations? They are any change to the regular testing environment that allows individuals with disabilities to show their current achievement level on exams. Examples include Braille or large print booklets given to students, allowing them extended time to complete the exam, putting them in distraction-free rooms, and screen reading technology. And those are just a few examples. There are many, many more. Who is eligible to receive test accommodations is any individual with a disability. The ADA defines an individual with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity or a major bodily function. Academic success does not mean the individual no longer needs testing accommodations. Someone with a disability may achieve high levels of academic success, but they still may be significantly limited in major life activities such as writing, speaking, or reading. A few examples of types of accommodation include presentation, response, setting, and time. The first piece of research I chose was conducted in 1998 by Hollenbeck and Tyndall, and they wanted to determine both general education and special education teachers' knowledge regarding allowable accommodations for students with disabilities on statewide tests. And additionally, they were interested in how their knowledge affected the validity of decisions. So to assess teachers' knowledge of accommodations, Hollenbeck and Tyndall used a list of 16 accommodations taken from Oregon's statewide testing manual, and they ranged from extended time all the way down to providing an alternate form of the exam given. Based on the manual, A through K accommodations were allowable and did not need to be marked modified if the protocol were used, whereas accommodations L through P modified the state assessment and thus should be marked as modified. When the researchers looked into the validity ratings of teachers' knowledge of appropriate accommodations, they were organized into 4 groups: strong, high decision power, average, high decision power, moderate group decision power, and weak, not to be used for decisions. Most of the teachers, 96% of them, fell into the weak knowledge group, with none of the teachers falling into the strong knowledge group. 3% fell into both the moderate group decision power and the average decision power. The results from this research study showed that teachers' knowledge of accommodations was limited enough that it put the validity of score interpretations in jeopardy. A second piece of research I chose investigated participation and accommodation on the Illinois Standards Achievement Test, or the ISAT. The researchers were also interested in testing the effectiveness of intervention with educators' decision making on appropriate test accommodations for students with disabilities. They set out with 3 objectives, the first being to describe decision-making strategies used by educators in reference to participation and accommodation for students with disabilities based on the 6-scenario model that I provided a snapshot of on the right side of the screen. The first being general education goals, which shows that participation is included in all parts of general education assessment with no accommodations, and it goes all the way down to student-specific goals, with the scenario being no participation in general education assessment with alternate assessments for student-specific goals. Additionally, the second objective was to design and implement an intervention with intent of training educators on how to best make decisions for instructional accommodations. And the third objective of the research was to test the effectiveness of their intervention model through pre- and post-intervention monitoring of participation and accommodation on the ISAT. When the researchers looked into the training of teachers on accommodations, changes were seen across both domains, mathematics and language arts. Fewer students completed the assessment without accommodations. So more than half of students received accommodations after training teachers on appropriate accommodations and when they were necessary. Additionally, more students fell into the alternate assessment category, which means having attainment of IEP goals served in place of taking the statewide assessment. And post-intervention, teachers were more likely to recommend accommodations or alternate assessments, which shows that before intervention from the researchers, teachers' knowledge on proper accommodations or alternate assessments was limited for students with disabilities. Helwig and Tyndall conducted a study with the purpose of looking into teacher accuracy in predicting accommodations for students with disabilities over 4 different grade levels. And additionally, they wanted to develop a profile of students who would benefit from the read aloud accommodations. However, for the purpose of my topic, I'm just going to focus on teacher accuracy in predicting accommodations. So when we look into the teacher rating portion of the research, teachers were asked to complete a survey on their students' skill level in both mathematics and reading based on a 5-point Likert scale, with 1 equaling very low proficiency and 5 equaling very high proficiency. There was also an additional question that stated, how important in generating successful performance is the accommodation for the student? Responses for this question ranged from very low importance to very high importance. When asking the question, was there accuracy for assigning students accommodation? A student was recommended for an accommodation if the teacher responded with either high importance or very high importance on their survey completed earlier in the research. And additionally, students were separated into 4 groups based on their strongest test performance, either in the standard version or the video version, which was the modified format, and teachers' predictions for the need of accommodation. 2 of the 4 groups that the students were split into represented accurate predictions from the teachers on students' ability to perform better on a modified format over a standard format, whereas the remaining 2 groups represented inaccurate predictions where the students were recommended to receive modified format, but in actuality they performed better on the standard format. I included a snapshot of teacher accommodation recommendation compared to actual student performance. And so looking at elementary school, that population is made up of 4th and 5th grade, and the middle school population is made up of the 7th and 8th grade students. So, when we look deeper into the results of this study, we can clearly see that teachers' recommendation for test accommodation was not effective, and it boils down to random guessing at that point because their actual student performance only coincided with correct recommendations approximately half of the time. So, keeping in mind the research previously presented, let's regroup and take a look at some current implications we're seeing through those first three pieces. First, there is no set standards for teachers and other educators to use when making decisions on accommodations as a whole, and specifically which accommodation would best suit the student's needs. Another one is lack of consensus over when use of accommodations are appropriate. Improper misuse of accommodations for students with disabilities does not allow them to display their true academic competence. Another one is overuse of accommodations may lead to adverse effects from unneeded and unnecessary accommodations, such as learned helplessness, and accommodating access skills versus target skills. So, looking at this last implication, a target skill is the core content that is being tested, whereas an access skill is the means by which the student reaches the target skill. For example, if a test given to a student is measuring reading ability, it would not be appropriate to accommodate the student by directly reading what is on the test. In this instance, you would be accommodating a target skill. Determining testing accommodations for students with disabilities that will produce valid and meaningful results isn't a straightforward task. We aren't looking at a one-size-fits-all approach, so how do we determine the best and most appropriate accommodations for students with disabilities? When we take a look at the database approach, we can see that, and based off of what I've included previously, the research thus far on testing accommodations is sparse in its findings on how misuse of test accommodations affects students with disabilities. So accommodation decisions should be made on an individual basis. It is difficult for teachers to reach a firm decision on test accommodations that preserve meaningful test scores. And then looking at the dynamic assessment of test accommodations, otherwise known as DATA approach. It's an individualized approach as well that helps teachers determine valid accommodations for each student. So within this framework, teachers provide short tests both with and without use of accommodations. And then following the test, they'll take a look at scores. And if there is a boost in performance is evaluated and compared to the effects of the same accommodation being placed on non-disabled students. Taking this into account, if the accommodation exceeds the boost that is expected for a non-disabled student, it is considered to be a valid accommodation.